The machine beeped once, then went silent, and in that silence, a young man named Daniel stood frozen outside a hospital room, watching a woman he barely knew fight for her next breath. Her name was Margaret. She was 24 years old, thin from weeks of illness, her skin pale under the white hospital lights. Daniel had seen her only a few times before, always from a distance, always too shy to speak more than a greeting. He worked at the small hardware store across from her family's bakery. She smiled at every customer, even on her worst days, and that smile was the reason he had noticed her in the first place. Now that smile was gone, replaced by an oxygen mask and a heart monitor that refused to stay steady. The doctor's voice cut through the corridor like a blade. He told Margaret's mother that her daughter needed an emergency operation on her heart, one that could not wait more than 2 days. The cost was more money than the family would see in 5 years. Margaret's mother sat on a plastic chair, her hands shaking, her eyes empty of hope. Her husband had passed away 3 years earlier, and since then, the bakery had barely covered rent and food, let alone an operation that could save a life. Daniel stood a few feet away, listening to every word, though no one had invited him into the conversation. He was not family, he was not even a close friend, but something inside him refused to walk away. That night, he did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed in his small rented room, staring at a folder that held every paper related to his savings. For 6 years, since he was 18, Daniel had worked without rest, saving every spare coin, toward a dream of opening his own workshop, a place where he could build furniture with his own hands, and finally escape a life of counting other men's nails and hinges. The folder in front of him held that dream in numbers. He thought about Margaret's smile. He thought about her mother's shaking hands. He thought about how easily kindness is spoken, but how rarely it is paid for. By morning, Daniel had made his decision. He walked into the hospital's finance office before the sun had fully risen. He asked to speak with someone about a patient's bill, and when the clerk pulled up Margaret's file, Daniel placed his entire savings account statement on the counter. He asked that the payment be made quietly, without his name attached to it. When the clerk asked why, Daniel only said that some things are worth more when no one knows who did them. The clerk, an older woman with tired eyes, looked at him for a long moment before nodding. She had seen many things in that office, but rarely this. Within hours, the operation was approved. Within 2 days, Margaret was on the table, her heart being repaired by surgeons who had been paid in full by a man she had never truly spoken to. When Margaret woke up from the operation, her mother wept beside her bed, holding her hand so tightly it left marks. Margaret, still groggy from the medicine, asked the only question that mattered to her. How did we pay for this? Her mother did not know. No one at the hospital would say. The bill simply showed as settled, paid in full, no name attached, no note left behind, only a small line that read, "Anonymous well-wisher." For weeks, the mystery consumed the small town. People whispered in the market, in the bakery, in the church on Sunday mornings. Some said it was a wealthy relative from the city. Others said it was a stranger, who had once been saved by Margaret's father years earlier. No one guessed that it was a quiet man from the hardware store, who barely spoke more than 10 words to anyone in a day. Daniel kept his secret buried deep. He continued going to work every morning, continued nodding politely when Margaret's mother passed by his shop, continued pretending that his life had not just been emptied of 6 years of saving in a single afternoon. He told himself it did not matter. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. But fate, it seems, rarely lets a secret rest for long. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after the operation, the hospital sent a routine letter to Margaret's home, thanking the family once again for trusting their care to the hospital, and mistakenly, due to a clerical error, the letter included a copy of the original payment record, with Daniel's full name printed clearly at the top. Margaret's mother opened the letter first. Her hands trembled as she read the name over and over, trying to understand how the quiet young man from the hardware store could have paid such an enormous sum. She did not tell Margaret immediately. Instead, she walked across the street to the hardware store, waited until the shop was empty, and asked Daniel directly if the name on the letter was true. Daniel could have denied it. He could have said it was a mistake, that someone else must share his name. But something in her eyes told him that lying would only insult the sacrifice he had already made, so he told the truth. Margaret's mother did not scold him for keeping such a secret. Instead, she wept, right there in the middle of the shop, thanking him in broken words, promising that her family would repay him, no matter how long it took. Daniel shook his head firmly. He told her that the money was never meant to be repaid, that he had given it freely, without any expectation of return, and that the family owed him nothing but their happiness. He asked her, almost pleading, not to tell Margaret. He was afraid that gratitude, forced and heavy, would create a bond built on guilt rather than genuine feeling, and Daniel wanted no part of that kind of bond, not with a woman he had quietly admired for years. But secrets in small towns rarely survive long, and mothers rarely keep secrets from daughters they nearly lost. That evening, Margaret's mother sat her daughter down and told her everything. She watched Margaret's face shift from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like recognition, as though pieces of a puzzle she had never noticed were suddenly falling into place. Margaret remembered him now, clearly, the quiet young man who always greeted her politely at the bakery counter, who once fixed the broken hinge on their front door without being asked, who never seemed to want anything in return for the small kindnesses he offered. She had always assumed he was simply shy. She never imagined the depth of what lived quietly behind his calm eyes. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret walked to the hardware store after it had closed, knocking on the small side door that led to Daniel's rented room above the shop. When he opened the door and saw her standing there, moonlight behind her, he felt his heart drop into his stomach. She did not shout. She did not cry. She simply asked him one question. Why would you give up everything for someone you barely know? Daniel struggled to find the right words. He told her the truth, as plainly as he could. He said that from the moment he first saw her smiling at customers despite her own hardships, he had admired something in her spirit that felt rare and worth protecting. He said that watching her fight for her life in that hospital bed had made his savings feel meaningless in comparison. He said that he did not do it to be thanked, and he certainly did not do it hoping she would ever feel obligated toward him. Margaret stood silently for a long moment, processing every word. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and hugged him, tightly, the kind of hug that carries more meaning than any sentence could hold. From that night forward, everything between them changed. Word spread quickly through the town about what Daniel had done. Some admired him openly, calling him the kindest man they had ever known. Others whispered that he was foolish, that no man in his right mind gives away 6 years of savings for a woman he barely spoke to. Daniel ignored both the praise and the criticism. He continued going to work each morning, continued living simply, continued treating Margaret with the same quiet respect he always had. But something had shifted in Margaret. She began visiting the hardware store more often, bringing him fresh bread from the bakery, sitting with him during his lunch breaks, asking him questions about his dreams, his workshop, his hopes for the future. Daniel, cautious at first, slowly allowed himself to open up, sharing stories he had never told anyone, dreams he had buried under years of hard work and loneliness. Their friendship deepened quickly, faster than either of them expected. Margaret found herself thinking about him constantly, comparing every other man in town to his quiet strength and unshakable kindness. Daniel found himself falling deeper into feelings he had tried desperately to suppress, terrified that hoping for more would ruin the fragile connection they had built. One evening, as autumn leaves fell across the quiet street outside the bakery, Margaret found Daniel sitting alone on the wooden bench where he often ate his lunch. She sat beside him without asking, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops. "I want to repay you," she said softly. Daniel shook his head immediately, the same way he always did whenever the topic arose. "I told your mother. I don't want anything back." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes steady despite the nervous energy behind them. "I'm not talking about money." Daniel looked at her, confused, waiting for her to continue. She took a slow breath before speaking again. "You gave me my life back. I want to give you mine, if you'll have it." For a moment, Daniel could not breathe. He searched her face for any sign of hesitation, any sign that her words were born from gratitude rather than genuine feeling, but all he saw was quiet certainty, the same certainty he had seen in her eyes the day she smiled at customers despite her illness. Still, a small doubt lingered in the back of his mind, one he would carry silently for years to come, though he did not yet know it. Was this love, freely chosen, or was this a debt she felt bound to repay? disguised in the shape of affection. He pushed the doubt aside that night, choosing instead to believe in the warmth of her hand as she held his, and the sincerity in her voice, as she promised him a future neither of them could have imagined just months earlier. Their story, as the town would later say, had only just begun. But stories that begin with debt often carry its weight long after the bill has been paid, and neither Daniel nor Margaret yet understood how heavy that weight could become. As winter approached that year, the town watched with quiet fascination as the shy hardware store worker and the once dying bakery girl grew closer with each passing week. Rumors softened into blessings. Even the harshest critics of Daniel's sacrifice began to admit that perhaps fate had guided his hand towards something greater than mere kindness. Margaret's mother, grateful beyond words, welcomed Daniel into their small home, as though he were already family. She invited him for dinner nearly every evening, insisting he sit at the head of the table, a place of honor he always tried, and failed to refuse. Daniel, for his part, began rebuilding his savings slowly, taking on extra work whenever possible, determined to prove that his sacrifice had not left him without purpose. He spoke often of his dream workshop, describing in detail the furniture he hoped to build one day: chairs with curved backs, tables with hidden drawers, cradles for future families who would trust him with something as precious as new life. Margaret listened to every word with genuine interest, offering suggestions, sketching rough designs on scraps of paper, imagining a future built alongside him, rather than merely beside him. By the time the first snow fell that year, the entire town understood that something rare had grown between them, something built not on convenience or circumstance, but on genuine respect and quiet devotion. Yet even as their bond deepened, a question lingered unspoken between them, one that neither dared to voice aloud. Had Margaret fallen in love with Daniel the man, or Daniel the savior who had given her back a life she nearly lost, and would that question, buried so deeply beneath gratitude and affection, one day rise to the surface and demand an answer neither of them was prepared to give? For now, though, neither of them worried about such questions. They were simply two people, drawn together by circumstance, choosing each day to build something neither had expected to find. And as the snow settled quietly over the small town, Daniel walked Margaret home one final time before the new year began, unaware that the choices they were about to make would shape not only their future together, but the 6 long years of silence that would one day test everything they believed about love, debt, and the true meaning of sacrifice. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early spring, exactly 1 year after Margaret's operation. The small church at the edge of town was filled beyond its usual capacity, with neighbors standing along the back walls and children peeking through the open windows. Nearly everyone wanted to witness the union of the man who had given away his savings and the woman whose life he had saved. Margaret wore a simple dress sewn by her mother, decorated with small white flowers picked from the fields behind the bakery. Daniel wore his only good suit, pressed carefully the night before, his hands trembling slightly as he waited at the altar. When Margaret walked down the aisle, her mother beside her, the entire church fell into a hush, so complete that even the birds outside seemed to pause. Daniel later admitted to a close friend that the moment he saw her walking toward him, every doubt he had carried disappeared, if only for that single perfect morning. They exchanged simple vows, promising honesty, patience, and loyalty to one another, no matter what challenges life might bring. When the priest finally announced them husband and wife, the church erupted into applause, and even the harshest gossips of the town found themselves wiping away tears. Their first home together was small, a modest 2-room house at the edge of town, purchased with the little money Daniel had managed to save since paying for Margaret's operation. It was far from grand, with a leaking roof that needed constant patching, and a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to stand in comfortably. But to Daniel and Margaret, it felt like a palace, built entirely from their own hands and hopes. In the early months of their marriage, life felt almost impossibly gentle. Margaret continued working at her family's bakery, waking before sunrise to help her mother prepare bread and pastries for the morning customers. Daniel opened a small furniture workshop behind their house, slowly building the dream he had once nearly given up entirely. Word of his craftsmanship spread through the town, and soon he had more orders than he could complete alone. Evenings were spent together on their small porch, watching the sun set over the fields, discussing dreams for their future. They spoke of children, of expanding the workshop, of one day traveling beyond the borders of their small town, just to see what else the world had to offer. Every conversation felt like another brick, added to a foundation they believed could never crumble. But foundations, no matter how carefully built, are rarely tested by grand disasters. More often, they are worn down slowly, by small things left unspoken, by quiet doubts allowed to grow undisturbed in the corners of a marriage. The first crack appeared almost a year into their marriage, though neither of them recognized it for what it was at the time. Margaret had begun spending long hours at the bakery, taking on more responsibility as her mother's health slowly declined with age. She loved the work, the rhythm of kneading dough, the warmth of the ovens, the familiar faces of customers who had known her since childhood. But increasingly, she found herself daydreaming about things beyond the bakery walls, about the small art classes she had once dreamed of attending as a teenager, before illness and poverty forced her to abandon such luxuries. She mentioned it to Daniel one evening, almost casually, as they sat together after dinner. She spoke of a traveling art teacher who visited the neighboring town twice a month, offering lessons to anyone willing to pay a small fee. She wondered aloud if she might attend, just to see if she still had any talent left in her hands. Daniel, exhausted from a long day at the workshop, barely looked up from the chair he was repairing. He mumbled something about the cost of lessons, about how tight their finances remained, despite his growing workshop orders, about how her time might be better spent helping her mother at the bakery instead. Margaret said nothing further that evening. She simply nodded, tucked the thought away, and continued preparing for the next morning's bread. But something small and quiet had shifted inside her, a seed of disappointment planted without either of them realizing its presence. Over the following months, similar moments repeated themselves in different forms. Margaret would mention a book she wanted to read, a dance held in the town square she wished to attend, a recipe she wanted to experiment with that used ingredients slightly beyond their usual budget. Each time, Daniel, focused entirely on rebuilding the savings he had once given away so freely, found reasons to gently discourage her small dreams, always with practical intentions, never with cruelty, but always prioritizing caution over spontaneity. Daniel did not realize the effect his caution was having on his wife. In his mind, he was simply being responsible, building a secure future for the family they hoped to start. He remembered vividly what it felt like to have nothing, to watch someone he loved nearly lose her life because his own family could not afford proper care as children. He was determined never to let financial hardship touch their future children the way it had touched families around him growing up. But Margaret, still young, still recovering from years of illness that had stolen much of her youth, longed for moments of joy that existed outside of survival and practicality. She wanted to dance occasionally, to paint occasionally, to feel like a woman living fully, rather than a woman constantly calculating what could or could not be afforded. The gap between their unspoken needs widened slowly, almost invisibly, hidden beneath the daily routines of running a bakery and a workshop, beneath the genuine affection they still held for one another, beneath years of gratitude that Margaret still carried, whether she fully admitted it to herself or not. It was during the second year of their marriage that Margaret became pregnant. The news brought immense joy to both families, and for a while, it seemed to breathe new life into their relationship. Daniel worked even harder at the workshop, determined to provide everything their child would need. Margaret slowed her hours at the bakery, spending more time resting, more time dreaming about the small life growing inside her. Their daughter, whom they named Charlotte, was born on a warm summer evening, filling their small home with a kind of happiness neither of them had fully experienced before. For months afterward, the small cracks that had formed between them seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by shared exhaustion, shared joy, and shared wonder at the tiny life they had created together. But as Charlotte grew older, and the initial excitement of new parenthood settled into routine, old patterns began to resurface, now magnified by the added responsibilities of raising a child. Margaret found herself increasingly isolated at home, caring for Charlotte, while also helping at the bakery whenever her mother needed assistance. Daniel, meanwhile, buried himself deeper into his workshop, taking on more orders than ever, convinced that financial security was the greatest gift he could offer his growing family. Their conversations, once filled with dreams and shared laughter, slowly narrowed into logistics. Who would watch Charlotte while the other worked? Whether they could afford new shoes for the coming winter? How many more years it would take before they could expand their small home to give their daughter a proper room of her own. Margaret rarely complained. She loved Daniel deeply, and she loved their daughter even more fiercely. But somewhere beneath the surface of her daily routine, a quiet exhaustion began to settle, one that had less to do with physical tiredness and more to do with a growing sense that her own identity had slowly dissolved into her roles as wife, mother, and baker's daughter. She began to wonder, quietly, privately, who she might have become if illness had never struck her as a young woman, if debt and gratitude had never shaped the foundation of her marriage, if she had simply been allowed to grow into adulthood the way other young women in town had, free to choose their own paths before choosing a partner to walk beside. These thoughts frightened her deeply, not because they meant she regretted her marriage, but because she did not fully understand where they came from, or what they meant for her future. She loved Daniel, she was certain of that. But love, she was slowly beginning to realize, could exist alongside quiet feelings of restlessness, feelings she had no idea how to express without wounding a man who had sacrificed everything for her. Daniel, for his part, remained largely unaware of the depth of his wife's internal struggle. He noticed she seemed more tired than usual, more distant during their evening conversations, but he attributed this entirely to the demands of motherhood, and assumed, as many husbands mistakenly do, that time and routine would eventually smooth away whatever weariness had settled over her. He continued working long hours, convinced that providing financial stability was the greatest expression of love he could offer. He rarely asked Margaret about her own dreams anymore, not out of neglect, but simply because the daily demands of survival had crowded out the deeper conversations they once shared so easily. It was during Charlotte's 3rd year that Margaret's mother passed away quietly in her sleep, leaving the small bakery entirely in Margaret's hands. The loss struck her deeply, not only because of the grief of losing her mother, but because it forced her to confront, more directly than ever before, the trajectory her life had taken since the day Daniel walked into that hospital finance office and quietly paid for her survival. She now owned a bakery she had never truly chosen for herself, raised a daughter she loved more than life itself, and remained married to a man whose sacrifice had shaped every major decision of her adult life, whether she had consciously realized it at the time or not. Standing behind the bakery counter one quiet afternoon, kneading dough with hands that ached from years of repetitive labor, Margaret found herself overwhelmed by a question she had never allowed herself to fully voice, even in the privacy of her own mind. If Daniel had never paid for her operation, if fate had allowed her to grow into adulthood without that singular act of sacrifice hanging over every choice she made afterward, would she have chosen this exact life for herself? Would she have chosen this exact bakery, this exact small house with its leaking roof, this exact husband who worked himself into exhaustion each day, trying to prove his love through provision rather than presence? She did not know the answer, and not knowing terrified her more than any illness ever had. That evening, she watched Daniel play with Charlotte in their small yard, lifting their daughter onto his shoulders, laughing freely, in a way he rarely did during their quieter moments together as husband and wife. Watching them together, Margaret felt a wave of love so intense it nearly brought her to tears. But beneath that love, quietly, persistently, the same restless question continued to whisper in the back of her mind, refusing to be silenced, no matter how deeply she tried to bury it beneath duty and gratitude. She began, almost unconsciously at first, to withdraw slightly from their daily routines. She spent more time alone in the bakery kitchen after closing hours, telling Daniel she needed extra time to manage the accounts left behind by her mother. She stopped mentioning her old dreams entirely, not because she had abandoned them, but because voicing them felt increasingly pointless within the structure of a life that seemed to leave no room for anything beyond survival and responsibility. Daniel noticed the withdrawal, though he struggled to name it clearly. He asked her once, gently, if something was troubling her. Margaret, unable to fully articulate the tangled mixture of love, gratitude, and quiet restlessness she carried within her, simply told him she was tired from managing both the bakery and their home. Daniel accepted her explanation, though a small, uneasy feeling settled in his chest that he could not quite shake, a feeling he chose to ignore rather than confront directly. As Charlotte grew into her 4th year, the small cracks in their marriage had widened into something neither of them could fully articulate, yet both of them could feel in the quiet spaces between their conversations, in the way Margaret's smile no longer reached her eyes the way it once had, in the way Daniel came home later each evening, telling himself that one more order completed meant one more brick added to their family's security. Neither of them recognized, in those quiet, ordinary days, that they were slowly drifting toward a moment that would test everything they had built together. A moment that would force them both to confront questions about love, debt, gratitude, and identity that neither had ever fully resolved since the day Daniel first walked into that hospital finance office and changed the entire course of both their lives. By the time Charlotte turned 5, the small house at the edge of town had grown quieter than either Daniel or Margaret would have liked to admit. Meals were still shared, mornings still began with the same familiar routines, but something essential had faded from their daily life together, something neither of them could name aloud, without fear of unraveling everything they had spent years building. Daniel's workshop had grown considerably by then. He employed 2 young apprentices, both eager to learn the craft that had once been Daniel's quiet act of rebellion against poverty. His furniture was known throughout the region, sought after by families who wanted pieces built to last generations rather than mere seasons. Financially, the family had never been more secure. Yet security, Daniel was slowly beginning to realize, was not the same as happiness, and providing for a family was not the same as truly being present within it. He noticed small things that unsettled him. Margaret no longer hummed while kneading dough the way she used to during their early years of marriage. She no longer asked him about his day with genuine curiosity, instead offering polite, distracted questions before returning to whatever task occupied her hands. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, had narrowed almost entirely into logistics concerning Charlotte's schooling, the bakery's finances, and the workshop's growing list of orders. Daniel told himself repeatedly that this was simply the natural evolution of marriage, that passion inevitably settled into partnership as years passed and responsibilities multiplied. He had heard other men in town speak similarly about their own marriages, and he found comfort in believing his experience was neither unique nor concerning. But late at night, lying awake beside Margaret while she slept, Daniel sometimes found himself staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly the woman who had once hugged him so fiercely outside his rented room above the hardware store had transformed into someone who moved through their shared life with quiet, careful distance. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her own private struggle, one that grew more complicated with each passing month. She loved Charlotte with a ferocity that surprised her daily, finding in motherhood a purpose that felt entirely her own, untethered from debt or gratitude, or the circumstances that had originally brought her and Daniel together. Watching her daughter grow, learn, laugh, and dream gave Margaret a sense of joy that felt pure and uncomplicated, in a way little else in her adult life did. But when she looked at Daniel, even now, even after years of marriage and a daughter they both adored, she still occasionally felt the shadow of that original debt lingering beneath her affection for him. She hated the feeling. She had tried for years to convince herself that whatever she felt for Daniel had long since transformed into genuine, freely chosen love. And in many ways, she believed it had. She admired his work ethic, his quiet strength, his gentle patience with Charlotte, his unwavering honesty in every dealing, whether with family or strangers. Yet beneath all of that admiration, a small, persistent voice continued to whisper questions she could never fully silence. Would she have chosen this life, this exact man, this exact bakery, if circumstances had allowed her the freedom to choose, without the weight of gratitude pressing down upon every decision? Had she ever truly separated her love for Daniel from her sense of obligation toward him? She began confiding some of these thoughts, carefully, cautiously, to an old childhood friend named Eleanor, who had moved to the neighboring city years earlier to study painting, and had recently returned to visit her aging parents. Eleanor, unlike anyone else in Margaret's life, understood the restless yearning Margaret carried, having pursued her own artistic dreams, despite significant family pressure to remain in their small town and marry young. Over several long conversations shared during Eleanor's visit, Margaret found herself speaking more openly than she had in years, describing not only her lingering doubts about the origins of her marriage, but also her buried longing to explore creative pursuits she had abandoned during her illness and recovery so many years earlier. Eleanor listened without judgment, occasionally sharing stories of her own life in the city, describing small art classes, quiet galleries, the particular freedom of choosing one's own path, without the weight of a town's collective memory pressing down on every decision. She never explicitly encouraged Margaret to leave her marriage or abandon her responsibilities, but simply by existing as proof that another kind of life was possible, Eleanor unknowingly planted a seed of possibility in Margaret's mind that would grow steadily over the following months. When Eleanor eventually returned to the city, she left Margaret with an open invitation, telling her that if she ever wanted to visit, even for a short while, she would always have a place to stay. Margaret thanked her warmly, never truly believing she would take up the offer, yet unable to fully release the idea from her thoughts in the weeks that followed. Around this same time, tension in the household increased due to a series of small but significant disagreements. Charlotte had begun asking about attending a proper school in town, rather than being taught informally by Margaret between bakery shifts. Daniel insisted they could afford proper schooling now, given the workshop's growing success, and encouraged Margaret to reduce her hours at the bakery, to focus more fully on their daughter's education and their own time together as a family. Margaret, rather than feeling relieved by the suggestion, felt an unexpected flare of resentment rise within her. The bakery, despite its exhausting demands, had become one of the few spaces where she felt a genuine sense of ownership and purpose, a space inherited from her mother, built through her own hands, entirely separate from the identity she had adopted as Daniel's grateful, rescued wife. She told Daniel, somewhat sharply, that she did not need him to manage her time or dictate how she balanced motherhood and work. Daniel, startled by the uncharacteristic edge in her voice, apologized quickly, insisting he only wanted to ease her burden. But the exchange left both of them unsettled, aware that something beneath the surface of their marriage had shifted into territory neither fully understood. That night, after Charlotte had fallen asleep, Daniel approached Margaret as she sat alone on their small porch, staring out at the darkened fields beyond their home. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, the question emerging, almost involuntarily, after months of unspoken tension. Margaret turned to look at him, startled by the directness of his question. For a long moment, she said nothing, searching for words that could capture the complicated tangle of love, gratitude, restlessness, and quiet fear she carried within her. "I don't know how to answer that," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, I love Charlotte, but sometimes I feel like I never had the chance to choose this life freely. I feel like I owe you everything, and I don't know where gratitude ends and love truly begins." Daniel felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted entirely. He had suspected, in quiet moments over the years, that some version of this fear lived within his wife's heart, but hearing her speak it aloud struck him with a force he had not anticipated. "You don't owe me anything," he said firmly, his voice trembling slightly despite his effort to remain calm. "I never wanted you to marry me out of debt. I wanted you to choose me because you wanted to, not because you felt you had to." "I know that," Margaret replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But knowing it and feeling it are different things. I've spent years trying to separate the two, and I still don't know if I've succeeded." They sat together in silence for a long while after that conversation, neither fully able to bridge the gap that had opened between them, both aware that whatever came next would require more honesty and vulnerability than either had allowed themselves in years. In the weeks that followed, Margaret found herself increasingly consumed by restless thoughts. She continued running the bakery, continued caring for Charlotte, continued sharing meals and quiet conversations with Daniel, but beneath the surface of her daily routine, a growing sense of urgency began to build, a feeling that if she did not confront her lingering doubts soon, she risked spending the rest of her life uncertain of whether her marriage had ever truly been a free choice. She began writing letters to Eleanor, describing her internal struggle in greater detail than she had ever allowed herself to voice aloud, even during Eleanor's visit. Eleanor responded with patience and understanding, never pushing Margaret toward any particular decision, but always validating the complexity of her feelings. Meanwhile, Daniel, sensing the growing distance between them despite his best efforts to close it, threw himself even more fully into his workshop, telling himself that perhaps greater financial security would ease whatever burden Margaret carried. He began accepting larger commissions, working later into the evenings, convinced that providing more would somehow answer a question that, deep down, he was beginning to suspect had nothing to do with money at all. Their daughter Charlotte, though too young to fully understand the tension building between her parents, began noticing small changes in the household atmosphere. Dinners grew quieter. Her mother seemed distracted more often, staring out windows during moments that used to be filled with playful conversation. Her father came home later, sometimes missing bedtime stories he had never missed before. Charlotte, in her innocent way, began asking questions neither parent knew how to answer honestly. Why did her mother seem sad sometimes even when she smiled? Why did her father seem tired, even on days he hadn't worked particularly hard? The questions, though simple, struck both Daniel and Margaret with unexpected weight, forcing them to confront, however reluctantly, the reality that their daughter was beginning to sense the same unspoken tension neither of them had found the courage to fully address. It was during this period of quiet unraveling that a letter arrived from Eleanor, inviting Margaret to visit the city for a 2-week art workshop, specifically designed for beginners, hoping to rediscover creative pursuits abandoned earlier in life. Eleanor explained that she had already arranged lodging for Margaret, insisting that the trip would cost her nothing beyond travel expenses, and encouraging her old friend to finally take the kind of chance she had never allowed herself since her illness so many years earlier. Margaret held the letter for days before showing it to Daniel, uncertain how he would react, uncertain even how she herself felt about the invitation. When she finally did share it with him, watching his face carefully for any sign of reaction, Daniel surprised her by responding with genuine, if cautious, support. "You should go," he said quietly, though something in his voice betrayed the fear beneath his words. "If this is something you need, you should go." Margaret studied his face for a long moment, searching for resentment or hidden hurt beneath his encouragement. But all she found was quiet, exhausted love, the same love that had once paid for her survival, without asking for anything in return. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "No," Daniel admitted honestly, "but I don't want to be the reason. You never find out who you might have become. I never wanted that. Not from the beginning." 2 weeks later, with Charlotte staying temporarily with Daniel's sister and the bakery placed under the care of a trusted longtime employee, Margaret boarded a bus toward the city, carrying with her a single suitcase and a heart tangled with excitement, guilt, fear, and a restless hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Daniel stood at the small-town bus station, watching until the vehicle disappeared entirely from view, unaware that this quiet, uncertain goodbye would mark the beginning of a separation far longer and far more painful than either of them could have imagined on that ordinary spring morning. The 2-week trip that Margaret had promised, both to herself and to Daniel, stretched quietly into 3 weeks, then 4, as letters arrived describing art classes that filled her with an excitement she had not felt in years, mixed with apologies for the delay and promises that she would return soon. Daniel read each letter carefully, sometimes multiple times, searching between the lines for any indication of what his wife truly felt. He noticed how her handwriting seemed lighter somehow, how her descriptions of the city, of Eleanor's small apartment, of the painting classes she attended each morning, carried an energy that had been absent from her voice for years. Part of him felt genuine happiness for her. Another part of him, one he was ashamed to acknowledge, felt a quiet, gnawing fear that the longer she stayed away, the more distant she might become from the life they had built together. He managed the workshop, cared for Charlotte with the help of his sister, and continued sending Margaret gentle, supportive letters in return, careful never to pressure her to come home before she felt ready. He told himself repeatedly that patience was the greatest gift he could offer her during this uncertain time, that trust, freely given, was the truest expression of the love he had always tried to show her since the day he first paid for her operation. Charlotte, meanwhile, grew increasingly confused by her mother's extended absence. She asked Daniel nearly every evening when her mother would return, and each time, Daniel found himself offering vague reassurances he was not entirely certain he believed himself. 5 weeks after Margaret's departure, a letter arrived that differed sharply in tone from all those that preceded it. Margaret wrote that she had decided to extend her stay indefinitely, explaining that Eleanor had offered her a small position assisting at the art studio in exchange for lodging, and that she felt, for the first time in years, a sense of clarity about who she was, outside the roles of wife, mother, and baker's daughter. She wrote that she loved Daniel and Charlotte deeply, that this decision had nothing to do with a lack of love for either of them, but that she needed more time to understand herself before she could return home and be fully present in the life they shared. She did not provide a clear date for her return. She asked Daniel to trust her, to be patient, and to explain to Charlotte, in whatever way felt appropriate for a child her age, that her mother needed time away, but loved her more than anything in the world. Daniel read the letter 3 times before setting it down on the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall for what felt like hours. He did not know how to interpret the vague uncertainty of her words, the absence of any promised return date, the quiet finality that seemed to hide beneath her careful, loving language. He wrote back immediately, expressing his support, while also gently asking for more clarity about her plans. He wanted desperately to respect her need for independence, but he also carried the practical weight of raising their daughter alone, managing both the workshop and, increasingly, aspects of the bakery that Margaret's trusted employee could no longer handle entirely on her own. Weeks passed without a response. Daniel wrote again, his tone growing slightly more urgent, though he tried carefully to avoid sounding accusatory or controlling. Still, no response arrived. 2 months after Margaret's initial departure, Daniel received a short letter, far shorter than any she had previously sent, explaining that she had grown overwhelmed trying to answer his questions honestly, and that she needed complete space, without correspondence, in order to fully understand her own feelings without outside influence, even loving influence, clouding her judgment. She wrote a single line near the end of the letter that Daniel would replay in his mind for years afterward. "I need to find out who I am, apart from what I owe you." Daniel sat with that sentence for a long time, feeling something inside him quietly break, not from anger, but from a grief he had never fully anticipated. He had always feared, deep beneath his conscious thoughts, that Margaret's love for him remained tangled with gratitude for what he had once sacrificed. Reading her own words confirming this fear felt like a wound reopening after years of careful healing. He did not write back immediately. Instead, he sat with Charlotte that evening, holding her closer than usual, trying to find the right words to explain her mother's continued absence without frightening her further. "Mama needs some time to think about things," he told her gently. "But she loves you very much. That will never change." Charlotte, though only 6 years old by then, seemed to sense more than Daniel expected from a child her age. She asked quietly if her mother was ever coming back. Daniel, unable to offer false certainty, simply held her tighter and promised that whatever happened, he would always be there for her, no matter what. As months turned into a year, the town began to whisper once again, this time with far less kindness than they had shown during Daniel's original sacrifice years earlier. Some blamed Margaret entirely, calling her ungrateful, accusing her of abandoning the very man who had once saved her life. Others blamed Daniel, suggesting he must have failed her in some unseen way, that no woman abandons her family without significant cause. Daniel refused to participate in either narrative. He continued working at his shop, continued raising Charlotte with quiet determination, and continued, in private moments late at night, wondering whether Margaret would ever return, and if she did, what kind of person she might have become during her time away. He occasionally received brief letters from Eleanor, careful and diplomatic, assuring him that Margaret remained safe and healthy, though Eleanor never shared many details about Margaret's daily life or state of mind, respecting whatever boundaries Margaret herself had requested. A year passed, then 2. Daniel adjusted slowly into a new rhythm of life, one built entirely around raising Charlotte and expanding his workshop into something that provided both financial stability and a sense of purpose beyond the grief he carried privately. He hired a kind, capable woman named Alice to help manage household duties and assist with Charlotte's care while he worked, though he was always careful to maintain clear boundaries, unwilling to complicate his daughter's life with confusion about her mother's continued absence. Charlotte grew increasingly independent as the years passed, excelling in school, developing a passion for drawing that Daniel secretly suspected she had inherited, at least in part, from the artistic pursuits her mother had chosen over their family. He never spoke this thought aloud, careful never to let bitterness color the way he spoke about Margaret to their daughter, no matter how much private pain he continued carrying. Occasionally, brief letters arrived from Margaret herself, each one polite, affectionate, yet carefully vague about her future plans. She asked about Charlotte's growth, expressed genuine longing to see her daughter again, and always ended with vague promises about returning someday, once she had fully found the clarity she still seemed to be searching for. Daniel responded to each letter with patience, though the patience grew increasingly difficult to maintain as years continued passing without any concrete resolution. He never remarried, despite occasional gentle suggestions from friends and family that he consider moving forward with his life. Something within him remained unwilling to fully release the hope that Margaret would eventually return, though he could never fully explain, even to himself, why that hope persisted, despite years of continued absence. By the third year of her absence, the town's whispers had largely faded into quiet acceptance of the unusual situation. Daniel became known simply as a devoted, hard-working single father, admired for his resilience despite the unusual circumstances of his marriage. Few people asked directly about Margaret anymore, sensing the pain that still lingered beneath Daniel's calm exterior whenever her name arose in conversation. Daniel found unexpected comfort during this period in mentoring young apprentices at his workshop, several of whom came from families facing financial hardship similar to what he had experienced in his own youth. He often found himself extending small kindnesses to struggling families throughout the town, quietly covering costs for children's school supplies, offering discounted furniture to families who could not otherwise afford basic necessities, continuing, in his own quiet way, the same spirit of sacrifice that had once defined the beginning of his relationship with Margaret. He told himself these small acts of generosity helped fill the void her absence had created, though privately, he sometimes wondered if he was simply searching for meaning in a life that had been fundamentally altered by loss he had never fully anticipated when he first walked into that hospital finance office so many years earlier. Charlotte, now 9 years old, had grown into a thoughtful, perceptive child who understood far more about her parents' complicated history than Daniel initially realized. She occasionally asked pointed questions about her mother, questions Daniel answered honestly, careful never to paint Margaret as a villain despite his own private pain. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Charlotte asked one evening, as they sat together, finishing a small wooden birdhouse they had been building together in his workshop. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but I hope so. And even if she doesn't, you and I will always be all right. We have each other, and that's more than enough." Charlotte nodded, seemingly satisfied by his honest answer, and returned to carefully painting the small birdhouse a bright shade of blue, humming softly to herself in a way that reminded Daniel painfully of the way Margaret used to hum while kneading dough during the early years of their marriage. As the 4th year of Margaret's absence approached, Daniel began, almost unconsciously, to accept a difficult truth he had resisted for years. Whatever life he and Margaret had once built together, it had fundamentally changed, perhaps irreversibly, the moment she boarded that bus toward the city, with a single suitcase and a heart full of restless hope. He did not know, as he continued raising Charlotte and building his workshop into a thriving business known throughout the region, that Margaret's own journey, during those years, had been far more complicated, far more painful, and far more transformative than the careful, vague letters she occasionally sent home had ever revealed. In the city, far removed from the quiet rhythms of the small town she had grown up in, Margaret's life unfolded in ways she could never have predicted the morning she boarded that bus with a single suitcase and a heart full of uncertainty. The first months had been exactly what she hoped for. The art studio where Eleanor worked buzzed with energy entirely unlike anything Margaret had experienced in her small-town bakery. She learned to mix colors, to understand light and shadow, to translate the restless feelings she had carried for years into images on canvas. For the first time since her illness as a young woman, she felt as though she was discovering a version of herself that existed entirely separate from debt, gratitude, or the expectations others held for her. But independence, she quickly discovered, carried its own quiet burdens. Money was tighter than she had anticipated. The small stipend she earned assisting at the studio barely covered her portion of Eleanor's rent and basic necessities. She took on additional work at a small bakery near Eleanor's apartment, finding a strange comfort in the familiar rhythm of kneading dough, even in an unfamiliar city surrounded by unfamiliar faces. The guilt of leaving Charlotte behind gnawed at her constantly, more painfully than she had anticipated when she first accepted Eleanor's invitation. She missed her daughter's laughter, her small hands reaching for help with homework, the particular way Charlotte hummed softly while drawing pictures at the kitchen table. Every letter she received, describing her daughter's growth, felt like both a gift and a wound, reminding her simultaneously of the love she still carried and the distance she had chosen to create. She missed Daniel too, though the nature of that longing remained more complicated, tangled still with the questions she had traveled to the city hoping to answer. She missed his quiet steadiness, his patient love, the particular way he listened carefully whenever she spoke, even during years when she herself struggled to articulate what she truly needed from their marriage. During her second year away, Margaret began seriously questioning whether her extended absence had been the right choice at all. She wrote several letters to Daniel during this period, expressing genuine uncertainty, though she often tore them up before sending, unable to fully articulate thoughts that remained frustratingly unclear even to herself. It was during this period of deep uncertainty that Margaret met a kind, elderly woman named Grace, who owned the small building where the art studio operated. Grace, a widow who had lost her own husband decades earlier, took a particular interest in Margaret's quiet struggles, often inviting her for tea after long days of teaching and painting. Grace listened patiently as Margaret slowly began sharing pieces of her complicated history, the illness that nearly claimed her life as a young woman, the quiet sacrifice Daniel had made to save her, the marriage built upon a foundation of gratitude she had never fully separated from genuine choice. Grace, wise from decades of her own life experience, offered Margaret a perspective she had not previously considered. Gratitude and love are not always separate things, Grace told her one evening, as they sat together in her small, cluttered apartment above the studio. Sometimes gratitude is simply the seed from which love grows. The question is not whether your love began with gratitude, but whether it has grown into something that stands on its own, independent of the debt that first planted it. Margaret carried Grace's words with her for months afterward, turning them over repeatedly in her mind, trying to determine whether her own feelings for Daniel had, in fact, grown beyond the initial gratitude that had shaped their earliest years together. She began, slowly, to recognize patterns in her own memories that she had previously overlooked, distracted by her fear of never having chosen her marriage freely. She remembered specific moments of genuine joy shared with Daniel, moments that had nothing to do with debt or obligation. She remembered late-night conversations about their dreams, shared laughter while building furniture together in his workshop, the particular way he had looked at her the day Charlotte was born, a look filled with wonder and love that had nothing to do with gratitude repaid. Slowly, painfully, Margaret began to realize that her years of restless searching had never truly been about escaping her love for Daniel. They had been about learning to trust that her love, however it had originally begun, had grown into something entirely her own, freely chosen, independent of the debt that first brought them together. But recognizing this truth did not make returning home simple. Years had passed. Charlotte had grown from a small child into a young girl who barely remembered the daily presence of her mother. Daniel had built an entirely new rhythm of life around raising their daughter alone, managing both grief and responsibility, with a quiet strength Margaret feared she no longer had any right to disturb. She feared, deeply, that too much time had passed, that whatever love Daniel once held for her might have transformed into resentment, or worse, indifference born from years of unanswered waiting. She feared that Charlotte, now old enough to form her own opinions, might resent her for the years of absence, regardless of whatever internal journey Margaret had undertaken during that time. These fears kept her paralyzed for nearly a year longer than necessary, trapped between genuine clarity about her feelings and genuine terror about facing the consequences of years spent away from the family she still loved deeply. During her fourth year away, Margaret began painting more seriously, eventually developing a small but genuine reputation within the local art community. She held her first small exhibition during this period, a modest showing in a corner gallery that displayed a series of paintings depicting scenes from her childhood town, the bakery, the fields surrounding her family home, and, though she never explicitly labeled it as such, a quiet, recurring image of a small hardware store bathed in warm evening light. Eleanor, attending the exhibition alongside Grace, gently pointed out the recurring imagery to Margaret, who had not consciously realized how frequently her hometown, and specifically Daniel's workshop, had appeared throughout her recent work. "Perhaps your hands know something your mind is still afraid to admit," Eleanor suggested softly, studying the painting of the hardware store with quiet understanding. That evening, returning alone to her small apartment, Margaret finally allowed herself to fully confront the truth she had spent years avoiding. She loved Daniel, not out of debt, not out of obligation, but because of who he genuinely was, a man of quiet strength, deep patience, and unwavering integrity. She loved the life they had built together, however imperfect, and she deeply regretted the years of separation her own fear and confusion had created. She began writing a longer letter than any she had sent in years, describing honestly the journey she had undertaken, the clarity she had finally found, and her hope, however uncertain, that Daniel might still be willing to welcome her back into a life she now understood. Without doubt, she had chosen freely. But before sending the letter, fear once again intervened. She worried that words alone could never fully convey the depth of her realization, that Daniel deserved more than another letter promising eventual return after years of vague, unfulfilled promises. Instead, she decided she would return home in person, without warning, ready to face whatever consequences her years of absence had created, ready to rebuild, if he was willing, the family she now understood she had never truly stopped loving. Meanwhile, back in the small town, Daniel had spent those same years slowly, carefully, rebuilding a life centered entirely around Charlotte and his growing workshop. He had, over time, made a quiet peace with the uncertainty surrounding Margaret's return, choosing to focus his energy on providing stability and love for his daughter, rather than dwelling endlessly on unanswered questions about his wife's future intentions. His workshop had grown into the most respected furniture business in the entire region, known not only for quality craftsmanship, but also for Daniel's continued generosity toward struggling families throughout the town. He mentored young apprentices, funded small scholarships for local children hoping to pursue trades, and became, in the eyes of the community, a symbol of quiet resilience and unwavering integrity. Charlotte, now approaching her 12th birthday, had grown into a remarkably talented young artist herself, her drawings displaying a natural skill that occasionally left Daniel staring in quiet amazement, wondering how much of her talent had been inherited from a mother she barely remembered. Despite the stability he had built, Daniel never fully released the quiet hope that Margaret might one day return. He continued responding warmly to her occasional letters, careful never to pressure her, careful never to let bitterness creep into his words, though privately, he sometimes wondered if he was simply waiting for a resolution that might never arrive. He had, on occasion, considered pursuing a formal separation, encouraged gently by well-meaning friends who worried that his continued waiting prevented him from fully moving forward with his own life. But each time he considered the possibility seriously, something within him resisted, an unshakable belief that the story between himself and Margaret remained unfinished, that whatever had originally brought them together still held meaning worth protecting, regardless of the years of separation that had followed. As Margaret's 6th year away approached, Daniel found himself, almost unconsciously, preparing their small home for a return he could not fully explain his continued hope for. He repaired the leaking roof that had plagued their house since the earliest years of their marriage. He expanded the small kitchen, adding space he remembered Margaret once wishing for during quiet conversations years earlier. He kept, in a small drawer beside their bed, every letter she had ever sent him, reading them occasionally on nights when Charlotte was asleep and the silence of the house felt particularly heavy. He did not know, as he continued this quiet, patient preparation, that Margaret herself was, at that very moment, finally boarding a bus back toward the small town she had left 6 years earlier, carrying with her not vague uncertainty, but a clarity she had spent years painfully earning, ready to face whatever consequences awaited her, ready, at last, to return home. The bus rolled slowly into the familiar town square on a quiet autumn afternoon, the same square where Margaret had once said goodbye to Daniel 6 years earlier, her heart tangled then with excitement and uncertainty. Now, stepping down from the bus with a single suitcase, far heavier with paintings and memories than the one she had carried away, her heart carried an entirely different weight, one built from years of hard-won clarity and quiet, persistent hope. The town looked both familiar and strangely different, storefronts repainted, new faces walking along streets she once knew intimately, small changes accumulated over 6 years of continued life that had carried on without her direct presence. She walked slowly through the square, her heart pounding with each step closer to the small house at the edge of town, uncertain what reception awaited her after so many years of absence. She had written ahead only once, a brief letter sent 2 weeks earlier, informing Daniel simply that she intended to return, without providing an exact date, unwilling to create expectations that fear might once again cause her to disappoint. She did not know if he had received the letter in time, did not know if he would welcome her return, or meet her with justified resentment after years of unfulfilled promises. As she approached the familiar path leading toward their small house, now noticeably repaired and expanded since she had last seen it, Margaret's steps slowed, her heart caught between overwhelming hope and paralyzing fear. She found Daniel in his workshop behind the house, exactly where she somehow knew he would be, focused intently on sanding the surface of a small wooden chair. He looked older than she remembered, streaks of gray now visible in hair that had been entirely dark when she left, deep lines of quiet exhaustion etched around eyes that still held the same gentle steadiness she had fallen in love with so many years earlier. He looked up, almost as though sensing her presence before actually seeing her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing in silence, absorbing the reality of the other's presence after 6 years of separation. "You came back," Daniel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with a complicated mixture of disbelief, hope, and quiet fear. "I did," Margaret replied, her own voice trembling slightly. "I know I don't deserve an easy welcome after everything. I know 6 years is a long time, and I know I have no right to expect things to simply return to how they once were." Daniel set down the piece of sandpaper he had been holding, studying her carefully, searching her face for any trace of the uncertainty that had originally driven her away. "Why now?" he asked simply, neither accusatory nor cold, simply seeking honest understanding. Margaret took a deep breath before answering, having rehearsed this moment countless times during her long journey home, yet still finding the words more difficult to voice aloud than she had anticipated. "Because I finally understand something I couldn't see clearly before," she said slowly. "I spent years afraid that my love for you had never been fully separate from gratitude, that I married you because I owed you my life, not because I truly chose you. I needed to leave to understand the difference, and I finally do." She paused, gathering courage before continuing. "I love you, Daniel, not because you saved my life all those years ago, though I will always be grateful for that. I love you because of who you are, the patience you've always shown me, the quiet strength I've watched you carry through everything, even during years when I gave you every reason to stop waiting for me. I should have found this clarity sooner. I should have trusted it enough to come home long before now. I'm sorry it took 6 years to understand what I should have known from the beginning." Daniel remained silent for a long moment, absorbing her words carefully, weighing years of quiet hope against the very real pain of extended abandonment he had carried throughout her absence. "I forgave you a long time ago," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "But forgiveness and rebuilding trust are different things. I don't know if we can simply return to where we left off. Too much has happened. Charlotte barely remembers you as anything more than letters and vague memories." Margaret nodded, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "I don't expect things to return instantly to how they once were. I only hope you'll give me the chance to rebuild what I broke, slowly, honestly, for as long as it takes." Their reunion that day did not resolve instantly into forgiveness and renewed happiness. Instead, it marked the beginning of a slow, careful process of rebuilding trust, one conversation, one shared meal, one quiet evening at a time. Charlotte, now 12 years old, greeted her mother's return with cautious uncertainty. She remembered Margaret only vaguely, more from photographs and letters than genuine memory, and she struggled initially to reconcile the stranger standing before her with the mother she had spent years imagining during quiet, lonely moments. Margaret did not push her daughter toward instant affection, understanding deeply that trust, once broken, requires patient rebuilding, rather than forced expectation. She spent weeks simply existing alongside Charlotte, offering quiet companionship without demanding immediate closeness, allowing her daughter the space to determine, in her own time, how much of her heart she was willing to reopen toward the mother who had been absent for so much of her childhood. Slowly, through shared drawing sessions in the evenings, through quiet conversations about art and dreams, through patient consistency day after day, Charlotte began allowing herself to trust her mother's renewed presence. The bond between them, though different from what it might have been without years of separation, began growing steadily into something genuine and increasingly strong. Daniel and Margaret's own relationship required similarly patient rebuilding. They spent long evenings talking honestly about the years of separation, about the doubts and fears that had shaped their choices, about the quiet resentments and hopes each had carried throughout Margaret's extended absence. Daniel shared, for the first time, the depth of pain he had experienced during her years away, the quiet fear that she might never return, the private moments of doubt about whether he had made the right choice years earlier in encouraging her to pursue her independence so freely. Margaret listened carefully, offering no excuses for the pain her absence had caused, simply acknowledging honestly the consequences of choices she now understood more fully than she had during the years she spent searching for clarity. Over the following months, their marriage slowly transformed into something neither of them had fully experienced before. A partnership built not upon initial debt or unspoken gratitude, but upon honest, hard-won understanding of who they each genuinely were, independent of the circumstances that had originally brought them together. Margaret resumed her involvement with the bakery, though she also continued painting regularly, eventually opening a small studio adjacent to Daniel's workshop, where she taught art lessons to local children, including Charlotte, who had grown increasingly passionate about developing her own artistic talents under her mother's patient guidance. Daniel, watching his family slowly rebuild itself into something whole again, found himself experiencing a happiness he had genuinely feared he might never feel again after years of uncertain waiting. He no longer carried the quiet doubt that had shadowed the earliest years of their marriage, the fear that Margaret's love remained tangled inseparably with gratitude. He understood now, through years of painful separation and careful rebuilding, that whatever love existed between them had grown into something entirely their own, freely chosen by both of them, independent of debt or obligation. One evening, nearly a year after Margaret's return, as they sat together on their small porch watching the sun set over familiar fields, much as they had during the earliest years of their marriage, Margaret turned to Daniel with a quiet smile. "I used to wonder if I ever truly chose this life," she said softly. "I don't wonder anymore." Daniel reached for her hand, holding it gently, the same way he had the very first night she had come to him, hugging him fiercely outside his rented room above the hardware store so many years earlier. "Neither do I," he replied simply. Their story, marked by sacrifice, doubt, separation, and eventual understanding, became, over time, a quiet legend within their small town, spoken of, not with the harsh judgment that had once colored early gossip about Margaret's departure, but with genuine admiration for two people who had faced profound uncertainty and ultimately found their way back to a love strong enough to survive it. Charlotte grew into a talented young painter herself, eventually attending the same small city studio where her mother had once found her own clarity, carrying forward a family legacy shaped by resilience, honesty, and the hard-won understanding that love, however it begins, must ultimately be chosen freely, again and again, for it to survive. Years later, long after the whispers of the small town had faded entirely into quiet respect, Daniel and Margaret's story took on a new chapter neither of them had anticipated during the difficult years of separation and rebuilding. Their workshop and studio, standing side by side at the edge of town, had grown into something far larger than either of them originally imagined, a small community space where young people came not only to learn furniture making and painting, but also to hear, whenever they asked, the honest story of two people who had nearly lost each other before finally understanding what it truly meant to choose love freely. Charlotte, now a young woman with her own growing reputation as a painter, often spoke to visiting students about her parents' journey, careful never to romanticize the pain involved, always honest about the years of confusion, separation, and difficult rebuilding that had shaped her own childhood. She believed, deeply, that honesty about struggle made the eventual healing more meaningful, rather than less. Grace, the elderly woman who had once offered Margaret crucial perspective during her years in the city, eventually passed away peacefully, leaving behind a small collection of letters Margaret had written her over the years, which Margaret later donated, with quiet permission, to a small community library, hoping her own story of doubt and eventual clarity might offer comfort to others facing similar uncertainty within their own relationships. Eleanor remained a lifelong friend, visiting the small town regularly, often bringing new students eager to learn from both Daniel's craftsmanship and Margaret's artistic guidance, The friendship between the two women, forged during Margaret's most uncertain years, remained a quiet source of strength for both of them throughout the decades that followed. Daniel, reflecting occasionally during quiet evenings on the porch he had once repaired, in anticipation of Margaret's uncertain return, often told Charlotte and, later, her own children, that the greatest lesson of his life had not been the sacrifice he made all those years ago in that hospital finance office, but the patience he learned to carry through years of uncertainty afterward. "Anyone can give something in a single moment of courage," he would say, his voice softened by age and hard-won wisdom. "The harder thing, the thing that truly matters, is choosing to keep believing in someone, and in yourself, through years when there's no guarantee the story will end well." Margaret, for her part, often spoke to young women who visited her studio, particularly those navigating their own complicated relationships shaped by circumstance rather than simple choice, encouraging them never to be afraid of seeking clarity, even if that search required difficult, painful distance from those they loved. "Love that survives doubt," she often told them, "is stronger than love that never faces it at all, but you must be honest enough to face the doubt directly, rather than letting it quietly poison everything you've built." Their small town, once filled with harsh gossip about a wife who abandoned her family, and a husband naive enough to wait for her return, eventually came to view their story differently, as an example not of failure or foolishness, but of the difficult, often non-linear path genuine love sometimes requires. Daniel never fully forgot the fear he carried during those 6 long years of Margaret's absence, the quiet nights spent wondering whether his patience was wisdom or simply denial. But he also never regretted the choice he made to keep the door open, to continue believing, even during his most uncertain moments, that whatever had originally drawn them together held meaning worth protecting. Margaret, in turn, never fully released the guilt she carried for the years of separation her own fear had created. But she came to understand, through hard-won experience, that acknowledging past mistakes honestly, rather than hiding from them, had ultimately allowed her marriage to grow into something far more resilient than it might have been without the painful journey both of them had endured. In their later years, as Charlotte built her own family and eventually brought her own children to visit the small workshop and studio where her parents had built their unlikely legacy, Daniel and Margaret often found themselves reflecting quietly on the strange, winding path that had brought them together, torn apart, and eventually reunited into a love neither of them had ever fully expected to survive such profound uncertainty. They understood, more clearly than most, that love built purely from convenience or circumstance often crumbles under real pressure, while love tested by genuine doubt, honestly confronted and patiently rebuilt, tends to grow into something far more enduring. Their story, remembered throughout the town for generations afterward, became less about the dramatic sacrifice that first brought them together, and more about the quiet, everyday choices that ultimately allowed their love to survive 6 years of silence, doubt, and painful distance. It became, in its truest sense, a story not about debt repaid, but about love, finally, fully, freely chosen, again and again, for as long as they both lived.